She stood on the court, the scuffed wood cool beneath her bare feet, the silence amplifying the distant hum of the school building. The air, thick with the scent of old varnish and faint sweat, was a familiar embrace. Just hours ago, laughter and the rhythmic bounce of the ball had filled this space, a symphony of belonging. But now, the silence felt heavy, isolating. Something had shifted. A shadow had fallen over the bright, energetic world that had always felt like home. The sport, her first love, the place where she had found her voice and her purpose, suddenly felt fragile, threatened by whispers and sidelong glances that cut deeper than any physical blow. What had happened? How had this safe haven become a battleground? The injustice burned in her chest, a cold fire that promised to consume everything unless she fought back. Stay tuned to witness how even the purest passion can face its greatest test. If this story resonates with you, if you believe in the fight for fairness and the power of finding your strength against the odds, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more true tales of resilience and triumph. From the moment she first felt the rough texture of the worn leather ball in her small hands, Anya knew she had found her world. It wasn't just a game. It was an extension of her. The squeak of sneakers on wood, the sharp slap as the ball hit the floor, the satisfying swish as it dropped through the net. These were the sounds that filled her days, pushing out the noise of a sometimes lonely childhood. She wasn't the biggest, the strongest, or the fastest, but she possessed an innate feel for the game, a connection that transcended physical limitations. Her joy was palpable. It radiated from her like sunshine on a summer afternoon. She would spend hours practicing, her movements fluid and natural, finding a rhythm that was uniquely hers. Basketball offered her a sense of belonging she hadn't found anywhere else. On the court, surrounded by other kids chasing the same simple goal, she was Anya, the girl who loved to play, who could see the open pass before it happened, who felt the geometry of the game in her bones. There were no judgments about her quiet nature off the court, no awkward silences to navigate. There was only the shared purpose of the game, the teamwork, the friendly competition, and the pure, unadulterated pleasure of the ball arcing through the air. It was a community built on sweat and shared dreams, a family forged on the hardwood. She learned early on that hard work yielded results, that dedication mattered, and that the bond between teammates was sacred. This initial joy, this feeling of finally being seen and accepted for who she was, grounded her. It was the foundation upon which her identity began to build, centered squarely on the love of the game that had captured her heart completely. She poured her energy, her hopes, and her nascent dreams into every dribble, every shot, every sprint down the court. It was her first love, pure and unconditional. The aroma of oil paints and damp clay usually hugged young Maya like a warm blanket in the art room. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, slanted across easels, illuminating vibrant splashes of color on canvas. This was her sanctuary, a place where the world outside. But one crisp autumn afternoon, the air in the room seemed to shift, growing thin and cool around her. She was meticulously painting the folds of fabric on a still life, lost in the texture and shadow, when a cluster of kids near the drying rack burst into laughter. They were talking about hair, comparing styles, complimenting braids and curls that looked different from her own. Maya had tightly braided pigtails, neat against her scalp, styled by her mother with care that morning. She hadn't thought about them much. They were just her hair. One girl, Sarah, With long, flowing blonde hair she constantly twirled, giggled loudly. Another, Mark, known for his loud voice and quick jokes, added a comment. They weren't looking directly at her, but their words seemed to float across the room, sharp and distinct in the otherwise quiet space. Sarah spoke of how easy it was to manage her hair, how it just falls right. Mark chimed in with a remark about needing special grease for other kinds of hair, mimicking a gesture that felt dismissive and strange. Maya's hand froze mid-brushstroke. The rich brown paint on her brush seemed to darken, losing its warmth. She felt a prickly heat rise on her neck, not from exertion, but from something else she couldn't quite name. They weren't speaking to her, not directly, but their conversation, their easy laughter, suddenly painted a clear line between them and her. Her hair, her very being, was other. It wasn't the kind that just falls right. It needed special grease, needed work, was fundamentally different in a way that seemed to amuse or confuse them. The familiar scent of paint now carried a faint, unpleasant edge, like something sour had been mixed in. The vibrant colors on the walls seemed less welcoming, harsher. The soft sound of brushes on canvas, usually soothing, now felt distant, as if happening in a world she was no longer fully a part of. She looked down at her hands, her dark skin stark against the pale wood of the easel. For the first time in this beloved room, she felt undeniably separate, an outsider looking in. The joy she had moments before evaporated, replaced by a hollow ache. It was a subtle thing, a whisper of difference, but the sting was sharp, piercing the simple happiness of her afternoon and leaving a mark she wouldn't soon forget. The tryouts had been grueling, a desperate reach for a higher level of competition, and she had made it. Stepping onto the field with the new team felt like entering a different world, a crisp, manicured landscape where the air itself seemed thinner, colder. But the chill wasn't just from the evening breeze. It emanated from the eyes that met hers, or more often, slid past her, as if she were invisible. This wasn't the casual camaraderie of the old team. This was a tight-knit circle, hardened by years of playing together, their bonds forged in a fire she hadn't been part of. The exclusion was immediate, a wall built silently, brick by brick. Huddles formed naturally after drills, heads bent close, laughter shared, laughter that died down abruptly if she approached. On the bench, she often found herself at the far end, a solitary figure watching the others clustered together. Their low murmurs and inside jokes, like a foreign language she wasn't meant to understand. It stung, a dull ache settling in her chest, heavy and constant. She could hear snippets sometimes, careless whispers carried on the wind.
Did you see that? She completely missed the pass.
Whatever.
Yeah, I don't know how she even made the team. Must have been a fluke.
Their voices, sharp as splinters, pierced the fragile hope he had carried into this new arena. It wasn't just the girls. The parents, too, seemed to watch her with an unnerving scrutiny. Sometimes, after practice, waiting by their cars, their hushed conversations would pause as she walked by, only to resume with a noticeable shift in tone, a palpable disapproval hanging in the air. One afternoon, packing up her gear, she overheard a parent speaking just loud enough for her to catch the words.
Honestly, it's like they're trying to lower the standards. We need players who fit here, who understand the culture.
The implication hung heavy, thick with unspoken judgment. It wasn't just about her skill. It was about her presence, her very being deemed somehow other. She felt a sickening lurch in her stomach, the vibrant green of the field suddenly seeming less like a place of opportunity, and more like a stage for her isolation. The smell of freshly cut grass and damp earth, usually comforting, now carried a faint, unsettling scent of judgment. Every touch of the rough soccer ball against her skin felt less like a connection to the game and more like a reminder of the distance between her and her teammates. They moved together, a fluid unit, while she often felt like a disjointed piece, struggling to find her place in their rhythm, constantly intercepted by invisible barriers. The dream of competing at a higher level was quickly dissolving into a harsh reality of being deliberately, consistently, and cruelly shut out. The air on the field often tasted like damp earth and cut grass, a scent usually invigorating, but now it carried a heavy weight under the gaze of Coach Harrison. He was a figure carved from granite and silence. When he stood on the sidelines, arms crossed over his chest, he seemed less a leader and more a monument, unyielding and seemingly impervious to the currents that flowed through the team. His eyes, often hidden behind mirrored sunglasses regardless of the sun's intensity, never seemed to linger on any one player for long, scanning the field with a detachment that chilled the soul. The sound of his whistle was sharp, decisive, the only clear communication he seemed willing to offer, slicing through the humid practice air. There were no encouraging words, no backpats, just the expectation of flawless execution met with stoic approval or silent, intimidating disapproval. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, an island of calm in the chaotic energy of practice. Yet that calm felt less like composure and more like indifference. The team whispered about him, their voices low and cautious, like rustling leaves in a storm. They spoke of a past glory he carried like a shroud, but none dared approach the subject directly. His office was a place players went only when summoned, and they emerged quickly, tight-lipped and often paler than before. It felt less like seeking guidance and more like facing a tribunal. The very air around him seemed thinner, harder to breathe. What truly unsettled many was the pervasive feeling that he saw the team as a collection of components, not individuals with struggles or triumphs. He didn't seem to notice the subtle shifts in alliances, the burgeoning rivalries, the quiet anxieties that gnawed at the edges of practice. He seemed oblivious to the unspoken tensions, the way certain players were isolated, the harsh words exchanged just out of earshot. His world appeared to be strictly lines on a field, times on a stopwatch, and scores on a board. Anything beyond that, the human messiness of loyalty, betrayal, fear, and hope, seemed to fall outside the purview of his stern, distant gaze. It was as if the team dynamics, the very heartbeats of the players he commanded, existed in a separate, invisible realm that Coach Harrison simply didn't inhabit. This detachment, this perceived unawareness, created a vacuum, a space where other forces, less benevolent, could easily flourish unseen. The field felt cold. Despite the heat of exertion, under the coach's indifferent watch, the air tasted of tension and damp earth, thick with the scent of exertion and stale popcorn. Every collision on the field felt heavier now, every challenge rougher. It wasn't just a tough game. It was becoming a relentless assault. Maria dodged one tackle, then another, the blur of opponents' jerseys a constant threat in her periphery. But it was the ones that landed, the ones that felt deliberate, that truly stung. A hard elbow caught her ribs during a contested ball, sending a shockwave of pain through her side. The whistle stayed silent. She stumbled, catching her breath, the metallic tang of blood suddenly sharp on her tongue. An opposing player, bulky and sneering, jogged past.
Maybe stick to knitting, sweetheart. This is a man's game.
The words, sharp and dismissive, cut deeper than the physical blow. The official, standing nearby, seemed to look right through the interaction, his gaze fixed on a distant corner of the field. It wasn't blindness. It felt like willful neglect. Later, driving towards the goal, Maria felt the tug on her jersey, vicious and tearing at the fabric near her shoulder. She lost her balance, the ball squirting away. As she hit the grass, the world, smelling briefly of crushed blades and cool soil, she saw the foot that had tripped her deliberately scrape past. The referee's whistle shrieked, but it wasn't for the obvious foul against her. It was a penalty called on her teammate 50 yards down the field for something unseen, something marginal. A collective groan rose from their bench. The injustice was palpable, a suffocating weight. It wasn't just one bad call, not just one aggressive opponent. It was a pattern weaving itself through the match. Every time Maria gained ground, every time her team found a rhythm, a whistle blew, a flag flew, or an opponent delivered a cheap shot that went unpunished. It felt orchestrated, a deliberate attempt to break their spirit and ensure their failure. The sweat stung her eyes, blurring the lines between fair play and foul, hope and despair. She heard a female opponent jeer from the sideline, her voice dripping with contempt.
Look at her, can't even stay on her feet. Weak.
The taste of defeat, acidic and premature, began to mingle with the dust and sweat. They were battling not just their opponents, but the very rules of the game as they were being applied, twisted to favor the other side. Each biased call, each ignored foul against them, chipped away at their resolve, adding layers to the feeling that they were not just playing a game, but fighting a rigged fight, alone on a hostile field. The air grew thick with unspoken judgment whenever she stepped onto the field. It wasn't just the cheers for the opposing team. It was the silence that fell when she touched the ball, the way eyes narrowed from the stands. From the opposing side, the glares were sharp and cold, like shards of ice reflecting a harsh sun. Parents leaned towards each other, their heads close, lips moving rapidly in hushed tones. Though the specific words were often lost to the wind and the general din of the game, the feeling carried across the turf, a palpable wave of dismissal, laced with something far more bitter. She felt their eyes following her, measuring her, finding fault before she even made a move. A misstep was met with smirks and triumphant murmurs. A good play was greeted with stunned silence, quickly followed by muttered accusations of luck or unfair advantage. Sometimes, fragments drifted across, sharp and cutting, whispers about where she came from, about not belonging, about how she got here. While outright slurs were rare enough to be shocking when they occurred, the constant, low-level hum of prejudice was a heavier burden, a persistent static in the background of every game. It was a chilling touch, not on her skin, but deep in her gut, a constant nod of awareness that she was viewed differently, negatively. And then there were the moments when her gaze would flick towards her own sideline. Not everyone, not even most, but sometimes she'd catch a look, a subtle eye roll from a teammate's parent after a less-than-perfect pass, a shrug that seemed to question her competence. These felt like tiny needles, sharper because they came from those who were supposed to be on her side. It created a suffocating pressure, a sense that she not only had to prove herself on the field against opponents, but also justify her presence, her worth, to the very people who should have been her loudest supporters. The smell of damp grass and rubber pellets, usually comforting, sometimes seemed tinged with the acrid scent of anxiety. Every breath felt tight in her chest under the weight of those countless judging eyes. The joy of playing, the simple love of the game, was slowly being eroded by the relentless, corrosive tide of sideline whispers and dismissive attitudes. It was a conflict fought not with cleats and balls, but with resilience, against a barrage of negativity. A suffocating silence descended upon her small apartment each evening, heavier than any physical burden. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the crushing weight of being utterly alone in this fight. She felt marooned on an island of her own making, or perhaps forced onto one by the relentless tide of adversity. Doubt began to whisper insidious questions into the quiet air, wrapping around her like a cold, damp shroud. Was she truly capable of this? The goals that had once seemed achievable, daunting but within reach, now loomed like impossible mountains shrouded in impenetrable fog. Every setback, every sneer, every dismissive word from those who sought to break her, chipped away at the foundations of her confidence, leaving her feeling fragile and exposed. The pressure was a constant, suffocating presence, pressing down on her chest until breathing felt like a conscious, painful effort. It wasn't just the external pressure from deadlines, expectations, or the machinations of her adversaries. It was the internal pressure, the one she placed upon herself to somehow rise above it all, to prove them wrong, to simply survive. The taste of despair was often on her tongue, a bitter, metallic tang that made even simple meals feel unappetizing. Sleep offered little respite. Nightmares often replayed moments of humiliation or failure, leaving her waking up in a cold sweat, the echoes of cruel laughter seeming to linger in the air. She remembered one particularly dark afternoon, slumped in a worn armchair, the gray light filtering through the window, doing little to lift the gloom. The scent of old paper from neglected books filled the room, a smell that usually brought comfort, but now only highlighted her stagnant state. A thought, dark and tempting, crept into her mind, the thought of giving up. What if she just stopped? Let the waves of pressure wash over her, cease the struggle, surrender to the exhaustion. The idea brought a fleeting, dangerous sense of relief, a promise of an end to the relentless pain. It felt like the only rational response to an impossible situation. The sheer, unbearable weight of the emotional toll was pushing her towards the edge of the precipice, the fall into oblivion seeming almost preferable to the agonizing tightrope walk she was currently enduring. She was drowning, not in water, but in the deep, dark ocean of doubt and loneliness, the surface shimmering miles above her reach. Every fiber of her being screamed for release, for an end to the suffering, for the simple mercy of letting go. A cold, biting wind whipped around her, mirroring the chill that had settled deep within her bones. She had felt stripped bare, exposed by the relentless cruelty of others, her very identity under assault. For a time, she had shrunk, letting their words echo in the empty chambers of her soul, threatening to become the only truth. But as she huddled against the unforgiving wall of the old building, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filling her nostrils, a flicker ignited in the darkness. It was small at first, barely a spark against the storm, but it was hers. She thought of her grandmother's hands, calloused but gentle, braiding her hair as a child. She remembered the warmth of her mother's embrace after a scraped knee, the quiet strength in her father's eyes when he taught her to stand tall. These weren't just memories. They were anchors, tethering her to a love and belief that existed long before the venomous whispers began. The faces of her family swam before her eyes, not in pity, but in steadfast support. They had poured belief into her when she couldn't find it herself. That love was a reservoir she hadn't realized was so deep. Beyond the solace of family, something harder began to form. A fierce, unyielding resolve born from the very attempts to break her. The taste of the humiliation, bitter and sharp, no longer just brought pain. It brought a potent fuel. They wanted to label her, to box her in with their narrow-minded judgments and cruel lies. They wanted to dictate her worth, to diminish her light until she faded into the background, accepting the narrative they had written for her. But as the cold wind continued to howl, chilling her skin, she felt a different kind of chill harden her spirit. A refusal. An icy clarity settled upon her. No longer would she accept their definitions. Their words were not mirrors reflecting her truth. They were simply weapons wielded in their own inadequacy. She would not let their fear and ignorance become her story. This wasn't just about enduring. It was about actively rejecting their power over her identity. The vulnerability hadn't disappeared, but beneath it, a new layer was forming, tough and resilient. The sound her own determined breath, steady despite the turmoil, was a promise whispered to herself. She would find the strength within, not just to survive, but to rise, defined only by the unwavering truth she held in her own heart. This inner resolve, forged in the fires of adversity, was the first step away from the shadows they had tried to cast her into. The air in the stadium crackled with an energy that felt less like competitive fervor and more like a storm about to break. The score was tied, the final minutes ticking away on the giant clock overhead, each tick echoing the frantic beat of Maria's heart. Her lungs burned, her muscles ached, but she pushed onward, the familiar scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass filling her nostrils. Around her, the roars of the crowd pulsed, a wave of sound that usually fueled her, but tonight felt charged with something else. A subtle, unsettling tension that had simmered beneath the surface of the game for weeks, now threatening to erupt. Every move she made seemed to draw an unusual level of aggression. Tackles harder than necessary, shoves away from the ball more frequent. It wasn't just the heat of competition. It felt personal, deliberate. She shook off a particularly rough challenge, her shoulder throbbing, and saw the sneer on the face of the opponent who had delivered it. A chill, sharp and sudden, traced its way down her spine. They knew what they were doing. They were trying to break her spirit, not just her game. Then came the moment. She broke through the defense, a sliver of open space appearing like a miracle. The goal was within reach, but before she could capitalize, a brutal, late tackle sent her spinning through the air, landing hard on the unforgiving ground. A collective gasp rose from the stands, followed by the piercing shriek of the referee's whistle. Maria lay there for a moment, winded, the smell of kicked-up dust thick in her nose. As she pushed herself painfully to her hands and knees, wiping sweat from her eyes, the words came, dripping with venom and contempt, loud enough for players nearby and even parts of the stunned crowd to hear. Standing over her, not offering a hand, but a malicious smirk, was one of the opposing players.
Honestly, look at you. Get up, you weakling. This sport isn't for people like you. Go back to where you belong.
Maria froze, the breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just an insult about her play. The implication, The cruel insinuation tied to her heritage struck her like a physical blow. It hung in the air, naked and undeniable. Another player from the same team walked up, adding his weight to the attack, his eyes cold.
Yeah, wasting everyone's time. Some people just don't have what it takes. Maybe try something less demanding.
The words, so casually cruel, stripped away any pretense. This wasn't just gamesmanship. This was overt, public racial prejudice laid bare on the field. The murmur in the stands grew louder, shifting from confused surprise to indignant outrage. Players on both sides stood still, some visibly shocked, others looking away awkwardly. The officials, caught in the epicenter of the explosion, looked stunned, unsure how to react to a moment where the lines between sport and blatant hatred had just been brutally erased. The tension was suffocating, the cheering crowd silenced, replaced by the uncomfortable hum of a game that had officially boiled over into something far uglier and more significant than points or victories. And there he was. Coach Miller stood perhaps 30 feet away, near the edge of the practice field, where the late afternoon sun cast long, stretching shadows. The air tasted of dust and sweat, a familiar scent that usually meant exertion and camaraderie, but today felt thick with tension, almost suffocating. The harsh words, the physical shove that had just sent her stumbling backwards, the jeers echoing in her ears, all of it happened within his clear line of sight. His hands were clasped behind his back, a posture she'd seen countless times before, the picture of calm authority, the guiding presence. But this time, the authority felt absent, the guidance missing entirely. His eyes, usually sharp and commanding, seemed distant, focused on some point beyond the immediate chaos engulfing her. A knot of ice formed in her stomach, cold and heavy, settling low as she watched him. He wasn't looking away deliberately. Not precisely, but his gaze held a strange, almost clinical detachment. There was no sudden movement towards them, no sharp whistle piercing the air to demand order, no booming voice cutting through the escalating cruelty. Nothing. It wasn't just the physical pain from the shove that made her breath catch. It was the sudden, devastating realization that the person she had looked up to, the one who preached teamwork and respect, was witnessing her humiliation and doing nothing. It felt like a betrayal, colder than any harsh word or physical blow. A silent, crushing abandonment in her moment of deepest vulnerability. The sound of her own heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and disbelief, drowning out the distant sounds of other players, unaware of the darkness unfolding. Every second stretched into an eternity, marked by the coach's stillness and the continued taunts. A bully's sneer was one thing, a painful but expected part of this nightmare. But the coach's inaction? That was a revelation. It stripped away any hope of immediate rescue, any belief that authority would step in to right the wrong. His presence felt like a heavy, silent judgment, not against the bullies, but against her, for somehow being in this situation, for being the one targeted. It was as if her plight wasn't important enough to break his composed posture, wasn't worth the effort of intervention. The sun warmed the dust around her feet, a stark contrast to the chill spreading through her veins. She felt exposed, small, and utterly alone on that field. The coach, a silent, unmoving statue of disappointment in the periphery of her vision. The memory of his passive form would burn brighter than any insult, a symbol of the systemic silence that allowed such cruelty to flourish unchecked. In that pivotal moment, his observed reaction, or agonizing lack thereof, didn't just fail to help, it amplified the despair, solidifying her status as the underdog left to fend for herself against overwhelming odds. The air in the small office was thick with the scent of sweat, worn leather, and an underlying chemical tang of liniment. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that sliced through the blinds covering the high window. She sat on the edge of a hard wooden chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the fabric of her trousers damp where her palms had been resting. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence that stretched between her and the figure seated behind the scarred oak desk. Coach Miller, usually a booming presence, was quiet now, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her, out the window. The fluorescent light overhead hummed, a low, irritating drone that amplified the tension. After the explosive confrontation, the shock of it still pulsed through her veins, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. She had expected fury, dismissal, maybe even outright blame. This summons felt like the final judgment, the definitive end to everything she had worked for. A knot tightened in her stomach, a physical manifestation of the fear and humiliation she carried. The cheap chair felt cold beneath her, a stark reminder of the sterile, unforgiving environment. She could still hear the echoes of the shouts, the cruel laughter, the sickening thud that had marked the breaking point. Every nerve ending seemed alive, prickling with residual adrenaline and dread. Coach Miller finally shifted, turning his steady gaze towards her. His face, usually set in an expression of practiced authority, seemed lined with something else now. Weariness, perhaps, or a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. He leaned back in his chair, the old springs creaking in protest, and let out a slow breath that seemed to carry the weight of the room.
"Look,"
he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, devoid of its usual command.
I saw it. All of it. What happened out there. It wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about something else entirely."
His words hung in the air, unexpected and heavy with a depth she hadn't anticipated. It was a glimmer, faint but undeniable, in the crushing darkness that had enveloped her. He didn't accuse, he acknowledged. He didn't lecture, he seemed to see. A tiny shard of hope, sharp and terrifying, pricked at the edges of her despair. Could it be possible? Could someone in power finally understand the true nature of the conflict she was facing? The air in the office didn't feel quite so suffocating anymore, replaced by a hesitant breath of possibility. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead felt deafening in the sudden quiet. She sat at the edge of the raised platform, the polished wood cool and unforgiving beneath her fingertips, a mirror reflecting the anxious tremor in her own eyes. Rows of faces blurred before her. Teammates, reporters clutching notebooks and recorders, a smattering of administrators and fans. This was a press conference, ostensibly about the recent turbulence in the season, but everyone knew the unspoken truth, hanging heavy in the air, thick as the cheap air freshener trying valiantly to mask the scent of nervous sweat. It was about her. About the slurs whispered, the malicious rumors spread like wildfire, the isolating stares, the relentless pressure that had nothing to do with her performance on the court and everything to do with the color of her skin. She had attended countless meetings, endured hushed conversations, faced down venomous glares in hallways that felt suddenly too narrow. She had pleaded for understanding, for intervention, only to be met with sympathetic nods that led to no discernible action. Or worse, thinly veiled suggestions that she was somehow overreacting, too sensitive. Coach Miller stepped forward, adjusting the microphone. A stoic figure, known for his reserve, he usually spoke in measured tones about strategies and statistics. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified, echoing slightly in the tense silence. He started, predictably, with the team's challenges, the need for focus, the coming games. She felt a familiar wave of resignation wash over her. Here it was, the expected deflection, the sidestepping of the real rot eating away at the team's soul. She gripped the edge of her chair, preparing to endure the rest of the performance. But then, his tone shifted. The practiced cadence faltered, replaced by something raw and resolute. His gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on her before addressing the assembled crowd.
We've talked about the season, about the wins and losses, but there's a sickness in our house right now, a corrosive force that no game plan can fix. It's time we stop pretending it doesn't exist or that it's someone else's problem.
A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Her head snapped up. Could this be?
For weeks, one of our athletes, one of our family members, has been subjected to abhorrent, cowardly acts of racism. Words meant to wound, actions meant to isolate and demean. This behavior is not only unacceptable, it is a fundamental betrayal of everything this team, this university, should stand for.
His voice, though calm, carried the weight of iron conviction. He didn't look away, his eyes scanning the crowd, daring anyone to disagree.
Let me be crystal clear. Racism has no place here. It is not tolerated, it will not be excused. To anyone who has participated in this, who has stood by silently, or who believes this kind of hatred is permissible, you are wrong, and there will be consequences. Our player, our friend, has shown incredible strength and grace in the face of this ugliness. She deserves our unwavering support, not our silence or our doubt. This stops now.
The words hung in the air, heavy with import. A profound silence followed, broken only by the faint whir of cameras. She stared at the coach, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. It wasn't just a statement, it was a shield, a declaration, a public acknowledgement of the truth she had been forced to carry alone for so long. The shock was absolute, overwhelming the fear and pain she had grown accustomed to. A wave of emotion, sharp and sudden, tightened her chest. Across the room, she saw faces frozen in disbelief, some pale with shock, others flushed with what looked suspiciously like trapped fury. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel entirely exposed. She felt seen. A stunned silence fell over the field, thick and heavy like damp wool. The air, moments before alive with the usual competitive hum and parental cheers, now crackled with disbelief. Every eye was fixed on Coach Miller, standing resolute, his decision hanging in the quiet like a thunderclap that had just passed, leaving only the echoes of its impact. Lena felt it first, a lightness replacing the crushing weight that had pressed down on her for so long. She looked at the coach, then cautiously at her teammates. Their faces held a kaleidoscope of reactions: shock, confusion, some outright anger, but on a few, a flicker of something akin to respect, or maybe, just maybe, relief. The usual hierarchy had been not just questioned, but openly defied by the man who held their collective fate in his hands. On the bench, the players who had been party to the unfairness exchanged venomous glances, their entitlement shattered. One player, the team captain who had spearheaded much of the exclusion, clenched her fists, her jaw tight. Beside her, another muttered just loud enough to be heard by those nearest, her voice laced with bitter resentment.
He can't do this. He's ruining everything.
The words were meant to rally discontent, a desperate attempt to cling to the old order, but they landed with less force than she intended, already undermined by the coach's authority. From the sidelines, the ripple effect was just as potent. Parents who had ignored the blatant bullying, or even tacitly encouraged it, now wore masks of outrage. Whispers turned into agitated murmurs, a low growl of disapproval.
This is outrageous. My daughter works twice as hard. He's letting her mess up the season?
A voice, sharp and cutting, rose above the others, clearly from the parent of one of the favored players. But across the field, other parents, those who had watched Lena endure the unfairness with silent frustration, began to nod, slow smiles spreading across their faces, a quiet wave of vindication passing through them. The dynamic shifted instantly. The space around Lena seemed to clear as some teammates subtly moved away from her, wary of being associated with the coach's controversial choice. But others, emboldened by the coach's stance, took hesitant steps towards her. A defender, previously quiet and aloof, met Lena's gaze and offered a small, almost imperceptible nod of solidarity. It was a tiny gesture, easily missed, but for Lena, it was a beacon in the sudden uncertainty. The team wasn't a unified front of disdain anymore. It was fracturing, forced to confront the moral question the coach had thrust upon them. Even the opponents on the far side of the field seemed to sense the shift, pausing their warm-ups to stare at the unfolding drama. The air tasted different, no longer just the metallic tang of sweat and ambition, but something sharper, the scent of challenge and change. The immediate aftermath was a fragile, tense quiet, a pause before the new currents of the team's internal life began to flow, irreversibly altered by one man's stand for fairness. The old comfort of the status quo was gone, replaced by the uneasy possibility of something different, something better. A calm settled over her shoulders, a warmth spreading through her chest that had been absent for so long. It was the quiet strength of a presence she now trusted implicitly. After weeks of navigating choppy waters alone, tossed about by doubt and fear, the steady hand of the coach had finally gripped hers. He hadn't offered platitudes or hollow encouragement. He had offered belief, solid and unwavering, paired with a strategic insight that cut through the noise. He had reminded her of her innate power, not just the physical agility everyone saw, but the mental fortitude forged in the fires of past trials. That was the revelation. The adversity she had carried like a heavy cloak wasn't a weight meant to drag her down. It was the very material from which her resilience was woven. It was fuel. Stepping onto the court now felt different. The harsh glare of the arena lights didn't feel exposing. It felt illuminating. The roar of the crowd, once a source of anxiety, became a vibrant energy she could draw upon. The familiar scent of polished wood and distant popcorn filled the air. But instead of tightening her muscles, it signaled her domain. Her grip on the racket felt firm, purposeful. The coach's words echoed, not as instructions, but as permission. Permission to be herself, to play with the freedom only true confidence could grant. She moved with a grace she hadn't possessed weeks prior. Her focus was sharp, zeroing in on the trajectory of the ball, the subtle shifts in her opponent's stance, the geometry of the court. The ghost of past failures, the stinging memory of malicious words, no longer haunted the corners of her vision. They were there, yes, but transformed. Each slight, each moment of despair, each time she had been knocked down, now fed a quiet, burning intensity within her. It wasn't anger. It was a deep-seated resolve, a refusal to let that pain be for nothing. The rhythm of the game felt intuitive, effortless. The satisfying thwack of the ball leaving her racket resonated through her arm, a clean, powerful sound. Sweat trickled down her temple, but it felt like validation, the honest byproduct of effort fueled by purpose. She anticipated shots, reacted with speed, and executed plays with a precision that surprised even herself. This wasn't just playing the game, this was claiming it. She wasn't fighting against her past, she was leveraging it, using its gravity to anchor her present performance, rising higher with every stroke, proving that even the deepest wounds could leave behind strength. The final seconds ticked away, each beat of the clock a drum against the thumping pulse in her ears. The air in the arena, thick with the scent of sweat, worn leather, and nervous energy, crackled with anticipation. Every eye was fixed on her, the underdog, the one they said didn't belong. The weight of past slights, the dismissive glances, the hushed doubts, they felt like an actual physical burden on her shoulders, adding pressure to the immense challenge before her. But something had shifted within her. The pain of prejudice had forged a core of steel where vulnerability once lay. She saw the finish line, a shimmering beacon, not just of victory, but of vindication. Her muscles screamed, a fiery protest against the relentless push, but her will was unyielding. The roar of the crowd surged, a tumultuous wave of sound that threatened to drown out thought, yet somehow it propelled her forward. She tasted the coppery tang of exertion in her mouth, felt the rough texture of the ground blurring beneath her feet, the cool rush of air against her heated skin. With a final desperate lunge, she crossed the threshold. Time seemed to hang suspended for a beat, the world holding its breath, before the realization crashed down. She had done it. The official raised his arm, confirming the impossible. A collective gasp rippled through the spectators before erupting into deafening cheers. She sank to her knees, the tension draining away, leaving her trembling but exhilarated. The sharp scent of freshly cut grass and damp earth rose around her, as tears, not of pain, but of pure, unadulterated triumph, blurred her vision. She had overcome the physical challenge, yes, but more profoundly, she had shattered the invisible chains of prejudice that had tried to hold her back.
No, that's impossible. There must be a mistake.
Another voice, deeper and just as furious, echoed the sentiment.
She cheated. Someone like her couldn't possibly win fairly.
But their words were futile, drowned out by the joyous clamor surrounding her. She looked up, meeting the gazes of those who had doubted and those who had believed. The gold medal was placed around her neck, cool and heavy, a tangible symbol of her struggle and her victory. It wasn't just metal. It was the solidified sweetness of justice, hard-won against relentless odds. She had turned the tables, not with malice, but with sheer, undeniable excellence. The path had been steep, paved with the stones of bias and unfairness, but she had climbed it, reaching the summit where the air was clear and the view, the sight of her achievement shining brightly for all to see, was breathtaking. This victory was hers, undeniably, proving that courage fueled by righteous fire could overcome even the most deeply rooted prejudice. The announcement hung in the air, a sudden, deafening silence following the speaker's words. All eyes in the room snapped towards her, but hers were drawn inexorably to their faces. The faces that had held subtle disdain, overt skepticism, and thinly veiled prejudice for so long. Now, they were masks of pure, unadulterated shock. Brows furrowed in disbelief, mouths slightly agape, eyes wide with something akin to horror. It was a visual symphony of undone expectations, a stark tableau of their world tilting on its axis. The air, moments before buzzing with polite chatter, became heavy, thick with unspoken animosity and crushing realization. She saw the quick, furtive glances they exchanged, seeking confirmation of the impossible, finding only the undeniable truth of her success hanging like a banner above them. A man who had often dismissed her ideas with a patronizing smile now gripped the armrest of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. A woman who had perfected the art of the eye roll whenever she spoke suddenly looked as though she might choke on her own breath, her carefully constructed composure shattering like fragile glass. They tried, some of them, to paste on smiles, twisted, unnatural things that didn't reach their eyes, which still held the stunned, vulnerable look of someone who had just been proven spectacularly, unequivocally wrong.
Well, congratulations. Unexpected, but yes.
His voice was rough, laced with the bitterness of forced pleasantry and undeniable defeat. Another, a woman whose cutting remarks had been a constant low hum of negativity, offered a nod that was less acknowledgement and more a spasm of unwilling recognition.
Impressive. Truly. Who would have thought?
The question wasn't genuine. It was a desperate, weak attempt to cling to their old narrative, even as it crumbled around them. She didn't need to say a word. Her success was her voice now, booming louder than any accusation or defense. Standing there, bathed in the light of her own hard-won achievement, she felt none of the vengeful heat she might have once anticipated. There was no desire to gloat, no urge to return their past cruelties. What she felt was a profound, quiet triumph that settled deep within her bones. It was the sweet, clean taste of vindication, not through tearing them down, but through building herself up to a height they couldn't ignore or diminish. Their discomfort was palpable, radiating off them like waves of heat. But it wasn't her doing. It was the natural consequence of their own prejudice being invalidated by undeniable excellence. This was the payback, the irrefutable proof that their judgment had been clouded by their own biases, that the person they had underestimated and scorned was capable of achieving the very thing they had deemed impossible for her. It was justice delivered not with a sword, but with quiet, unwavering success, reflected back at them from the surfaces of their own stunned, pale faces. The echoes of the final whistle had long faded, but the memory of the journey remained sharp, etched into the very fibers of her being. She looked back at the path she had walked, a path marred by the thorns of hate and prejudice, yet ultimately leading to triumph. The weight that had pressed down on her for so long, the invisible burden of being judged not by her skill or character, but by the color of her skin, had finally lifted. It was a freedom that felt both exhilarating and deeply unsettling, a stark reminder of how accustomed she had become to carrying that load. The scars weren't visible, but the emotional impact of confronting and overcoming racism was a permanent part of her story, a resilience forged in the crucible of injustice. And then there was the coach, His presence throughout had been the steady hand guiding her through the storm. He hadn't just taught her the game. He had shown her what unwavering support looked like. He hadn't pretended the racism wasn't there, but he had stood beside her, a bulwark against the tide of negativity. His quiet strength, his refusal to let the ugliness win, had been a profound lesson in allyship. The power of someone using their position, their voice, to protect and uplift another, simply because it was the right thing to do. It illuminated the truth that battling injustice wasn't a solitary fight. It required courage, yes, but also connection, empathy, and a willingness to stand tall for others. The future now stretched before her, no longer a murky, uncertain landscape clouded by fear, but a wide-open road paved with the cobblestones of perseverance. The lesson was undeniable. When faced with adversity, when the world seems determined to push you down based on who you are, the only path forward is through. Through the pain, through the doubt, through the systems designed to diminish you. And just as crucial was the lesson for those who witnessed the struggle. That silence is a choice, and inaction is a form of complicity. True strength lay not just in personal triumph, but in building a world where such battles were no longer necessary. A world where allyship wasn't an act of heroism, but a simple, fundamental aspect of humanity. The warmth of this realization settled over her, a peaceful calm after the tempest. The air around her seemed lighter, carrying the scent of fresh possibility. The journey had ended, but the lessons it taught were just beginning their true work in the world. The pain had been real, the struggle immense, but the justice won felt profound. A victory not just for one person, but a testament to the power of standing firm against the forces of division. The weight lifted from her shoulders felt less like an absence and more like a lightness, a freedom that allowed her to move forward, not forgetting the past, but transformed by it. It was a powerful truth whispering on the wind, that courage is found not in the absence of fear, but in the face of it. And that hope, like justice, is a seed that once planted and nurtured, can bloom even in the harshest soil. The memories of the cheers, the taste of victory, and the quiet strength of her coach intertwined, leaving a lasting impression. The path ahead was clear, not just for her, but perhaps, just perhaps, for others watching, others who needed to know that even in the darkest moments, perseverance and the hand of an ally could pave the way to a brighter future. The world outside felt quieter now, more observant, as if holding its breath, watching the dawn break after a long, difficult night.